Hello, everyone, and thank you guys for joining us today for our webinar, 5 Steps to Optimize Cloud Spend. I'm Rachel Chisholm, ABM Manager here at Armor and the host for today's broadcast. Before we get started, I'd like to cover a few webinar housekeeping tips. So all attendees are currently on mute and will remain so throughout the duration of the broadcast. Please use the chat window to inform us if you have any audio or technical issues. And if there are any initial sound issues, we do recommend calling in via phone instead of audio through your computer. Throughout and at the end of our presentation, we would love to answer any questions that you may have, so please feel free to use the question section in GoToWebinar to submit your questions on any of the topics being discussed. And then lastly, we will be recording today's webinar, and an edited version will be sent out to all attendees after the event today. So with us today, we have Josh Vasquez, our Chief Technology Officer here at Armor, and then we also have Jeff Collins, the Chief Strategy Officer at one of our partners, Lightstream. Josh is responsible for all aspects of Armor's engineering and product development, and with extensive experience in application development and architecture, Josh helps chart a strategic vision for Armor's secured cloud infrastructure. Jeff has actually more than 15 years of diverse experience, including extensive experience in designing and implementing infrastructure, application, and security convergence solutions for Fortune 500 companies throughout the world. With that, Josh, I will turn it over to you and we can get started.
Oh, great. Thanks, Rachel. So go over a little bit of the agenda that we're going to go through in this webinar. We're going to go through risk in the cloud, formulating your secured cloud strategy, optimizing spend in the cloud, and then at the end we'll go through a little bit of a Q&A session. Before we get started, let's do a webinar poll, and I'll hand it back to you, Rachel.
Sure, yeah, so our first webinar poll question is rate your company's current cloud strategy, 1 through 5, with 5 being the highest. So just based off of how you feel your current strategy is right now, how would you rate what you're doing with your company? We'll give a few seconds for those answers to come in. Perfect. Looks like we have the majority of answers. So let's see what we've got. Looks like the majority would rate it pretty high at 5. I think that's really great. I mean, there's always room for improvement. Obviously, there's some people that would kind of rate theirs more at a 1, a 2, and a 4. But, I do think it's great to have a positive outlook on where you're at. And then, obviously, why you guys joined our webinar today is how do you further optimize to make sure that you're on the right path, especially as changes happen so quickly and fluidly, with cloud and development. So, perfect. There we go. Sorry, guys, we got hooked up on our slide wasn't moving for you. There you go, Josh. You want to go back into the risk in the cloud section?
Absolutely. Let's get started. So when we talk about a risk in the cloud, there's a number of factors that you're going to think about as you're devising sort of your strategy and moving out there. There's a number of pillars that you want to sort of think about holistically, and I know Jeff has a great perspective on this. So, Jeff, what do you think?
Thanks, Josh. Yeah, one of the interesting things is so often we hear from customers, we hear from organizations that have gone to the cloud, and when we're thinking about the actual financial components of cloud, which affects so many of us, our financial teams are looking for alignment of our cloud spend directly with the business objective. We're trying to keep costs inside of a budget if we're in an IT organization, or maybe it's a security organization or a product organization that's leading a cloud motion. And through all those, one of the biggest things we always hear is, to optimize spend, we really just need to, buy reserved instances with AWS or reservations with Azure or whatever it might be. And one of the things that we've seen, especially with large successful organizations, as they've grown their cloud maturity and they've really built practices and capabilities around that are really financially aligned, they've really focused on 4 core areas. And these areas are really having a robust cloud strategy, again, that aligns with the business outcome that the business is looking for. So that's one of the things. And you'll hear us talk about this one quite a bit throughout the webinar itself. The component of risk. So often risk comes in many forms. Both Armor and Lightstream are very focused on risk from a security perspective, but we also have operational risk that we pull into our umbrellas. We also have availability risk. if you're going down the construct of Google's architecture for building scalable clouds using SRE or site reliability engineering, that's a huge component that drives that. And that's a huge component that helps align cost directly with the needs of the business and the availability therein. Cloud migration. How do you leverage additional clouds, or how do you move workloads intelligently? How do you use modern architectures, whether it's a web application or maybe it's a 3-tier architecture that you may have inside of your ecosystem? And then last but definitely not least is that construct of cloud optimization. How do we procure the services that align directly with our business? How do we procure the right spending mechanisms with an individual cloud provider? Because all of them have similarities, but all of them also have vast differences. And how do you leverage those directly within your environment? And so as we go through this, you're going to see a lot of these individual components as we talk through the individual topic areas within the webinar.
That's great. Thanks, Jeff. So as you think about leveraging, or as you look at all 4 of those pillars in devising your plan, you start thinking about the full scope of a strategic direction, right? So as you start thinking about optimizing not only your ROI or why your strategy is for going to the cloud, whether it be its scaling mechanisms, whether it be cost, whether it be just leveraging some technology or service that you just don't have in-house, it's good to always have alignment through and through as you start thinking about a cloud strategy, from stakeholders all the way down to your strategy. So, a prime example of this is I'm going to the cloud for cost optimization, right? I mean, that was really, I think, the originating factor for, I think, a lot of companies running to the cloud is I don't have to spend upfront in a CapEx model and have a, $5-6 million for the beginning of the year moving into technology spend and sort of changing a little bit of that into an OpEx model, whereas I can consume what I use, right? So the first thoughts there was, well, great, let's jump right into it. Well, then it opened up a lot of risk factors, I think, as you moved into there. Financial risk was probably the first one that we all realized. We all realized that as you're starting to spin up all of these compute resources, the billing ticker was going, right? So at the end of the month, you were left with a bill that was a little bit larger than what your strategic plan was, which was cost savings, right? So I think that, what we'll talk about going through this webinar is how do you think about moving into the cloud, and how do you make sure that if your plan is for some cost reduction or some benefit of technology, how are you smart about moving into that strategic direction and ensuring that you're checking those boxes to make sure that you're realizing the strategic plan for you moving out there. So a couple of components and strategies of how you move out there. I know Lightstream has a real in-depth process for moving to the cloud. So Jeff, can you talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, thanks, Josh. So as customers look to move to the cloud and they look to build that maturity, this is a great 5-step process that really guides you through how to get down that path effectively. Whether you have a extremely mature model on premise wherein you're using infrastructure as code and all those individual components, and as you move to the cloud or you're looking to add another cloud provider into your ecosystem, these 5 steps really help you, and they're a cyclical model. It's a continuous model as you go forth in the cloud. Really starting with that construct of assessment and planning, understanding your ecosystem, whether that ecosystem you're performing an assessment for the survivability or the availability of an application, or you're looking at security, or you're looking at operational controls, or any other specific areas. You're really pulling that inside of that assessment, leveraging those assessment findings to build a great plan. How are we going to deploy inside of the cloud? Are we going containers? Are we going some other type of microservice? Are we going down a monolithic path? How are we going down those individual paths? What do our applications look like, and what will our applications look like in the future? Are those going to evolve? Is the cloud an intermediate step where we're going to do a forklift and a fix, and then ultimately an optimization motion? Those are all those components that we really want to think about within that assessment and that planning phase. Then we go into that validation. All of us have lived through this for so many years where, with all the assessment and the planning in the world, we always have to have that validation step. Did everything go and is the architecture aligned with the business? Really that check of everything that we did inside of that assessment and that planning phase. Ultimately into that build, building the core foundation of a cloud service. And that core foundation is everything from, if you're in AWS, it's a VPC, it's subnets, it's security groups. It's how are we going to tie in that network connectivity? And then how are we going to deploy those applications? Are we going to use service constructs within AWS like Elastic Beanstalk or RDS? Are we going to deploy fully on instances? Or are we going to deploy in some means of a container ecosystem, whether that's an Amazon-driven Kubernetes environment or a container environment? Or is that something where we're literally just laying containers on top of individual instances themselves? We then go into the migration component. Let's get those workloads inside of that environment. Bring those over. Maybe that's something where we're moving the workloads as they are, that forklift type of model. Or maybe we're moving in applications where we're literally bringing in code into a whole new container ecosystem. And then we get into this optimization motion of continuous alignment of the environment from a financial perspective, an operational perspective, security, as well as availability, and really tying those in and continually looking at those pieces throughout the life cycle of that environment. Again, this is a continuous process. So most customers keep going through this motion over and over and over throughout the life of the cloud. That may be because of maturity. Maybe they initially started, now they're going down a CI/CD path or an infrastructure as code path, whatever it may be, and so on and so forth. Let me hand that back over to you, Josh, and let's go to the next slide.
Absolutely. So when you're thinking about that cloud security, this strategy, you have many things to think about. As Jeff talked about, as you're moving into the cloud, and there's going to be different maturity phases. And there's a continuous, I would say, improvement process as you're moving through that strategy. So when you're moving into the cloud, there might be a lift and shift. That might be a phase one. As you're moving into maybe your phase two, maybe your engineers, your developers are learning a little bit more of how to work with the cloud, how to develop in the cloud, or adopt some of the newer capabilities. Your strategy continuously evolves, and it continuously has to be, I would say, thought of when you're adopting new features and new risks associated to those new services. So when you are trying to put together a plan, we think of it as in a couple of areas of policy, technology, and environment. When you're thinking about policy, it's sort of your more, I would say, strategy of what you're going to be working with and what are the guardrails and what are those rules of engagement between you and your cloud providers, right? From a shared responsibility model, or if I'm going to a multi-cloud endeavor, right? Because you might get better costs with AWS app services versus maybe some of your EC2 instances, just depending on what your need is. You're moving into technology, you're starting to vet against what I'm trying to do from a strategy and policy perspective. What are the technology choices that I have, right? Whether I'm going to use some container security or workload security or multi-factor authentication of how am I going to sort of manage my risk as I get into that cloud environment, not just risk of do my developers know what they're doing in that cloud environment and are they going to keep everything safe? You're starting to think about now, how do I manage it with technology, whether it be a security posture management platform or whether it be policy driven or whether it be more of how am I going to manage security and technology within that environment. And then finally, you're thinking about now at the end is, do my teams understand software-defined networking? Was a public IP versus a non-routable IP? Or do I understand microservices, whether it be an app function all the way down to your data model of RDS? Or am I going to use containers? So I think when you're holistically thinking of your cloud strategy, I think ultimately you're going to cloud for scale, for cost benefit, as well as some efficiencies internally to the business. So if you're trying to manage your risk against your business, whether it be via technology or brand, you're really trying to gain those efficiencies. So I think you have to think of it holistically and not it just be a tech conversation. I think a tech conversation pulling in a business strategy against hard ROIs or benefits around services, I think is the right way to look at your whole plan. So I would think about it from those three pillars if you are trying to gain those efficiencies and advantages moving into that cloud. I think this is a good time to pause for another webinar poll. So Rachel?
Perfect. So our question here is, do you feel that you accurately know your current cloud costs? Yes or no? Give a few seconds for everybody to get everything in. Okay. Looks like the majority of people have put their response in. Let's see what the results are. 71% say no, which, to your point of, so many VMs being able to, with AWS, and they make it easy to be able to spin up instances. And so when you have so many different teams utilizing the cloud potentially, do you really have the full scope and understanding of, where your cloud spend is actually, eating away at? So I think it's very in line with how the majority of people that we've even talked to at reInvent, Reinforce, and other AWS events, and just public cloud events have felt about kind of that optimization and that level of spend. What do you think about this, Josh?
Yeah, I mean, if you said no, it's not, don't be ashamed at it. I think that's a majority of the organizations. I think that as you go into cloud, they make it very easy to adopt technologies and services. It's a login away. It's a button click away. I think teams are anxious to develop on the new services and new platforms, and your bill just grows, right? So I think governance around what you're leveraging, what you're utilizing, I think those are good conversations to have. I think before you adopt a feature or capability, I think it's a good holistic strategy to have with your peers, with upper management, to understand, are these the right things to turn on just because I get access to turning it on? Jeff, what do you think?
Yeah, I agree, Josh. I mean, it's always interesting. When you think about costs come in so many forms inside of the cloud, and some of those forms are easy to attach to an individual business unit or an individual methodology or framework you're trying to do inside of the cloud. And that's often done through tags. All of us are familiar with tags and the capability, or I'm guessing a lot of us are. And as you go down that path, the one big problem we see with a lot of clouds, and where a lot of customers have issues with aligning cost, is really with what are the things, or what can we do with the things that are non-taggable? Things like bandwidth charges, egress charges, things like that. Those become often problematic, and that's one of the biggest things that drives a lot of when we talk to customers in that no category. They know the costs at a macro level. What they don't know are the costs at a micro level. And there's a lot of methodologies that we'll talk through towards the end of this webinar that talk through some ways that you can align those costs, those bandwidth usage charge, those non-taggable resource types, where you can align those with cost to a business unit, allocate them, and still do it without the construct or the capability of tagging. So some interesting stuff coming up when we drive further through this webinar. Thanks, Josh.
Awesome. All right. Well, great. So now let's get into it. I think why you all are here is really, what are some of those tricks to optimizing the cloud? Jeff, why don't you kick us off?
Yeah, thanks, Josh. So when we've talked to customers, and when we've gone out to the market itself and looked at overarching macro level statistics, we found some interesting pieces, and the pieces here come from industry think tanks, industry groups, etc. And they aligned really well with the findings that both Lightstream and Armor have had as we've talked to our customers. One of the biggest things is, so if you look at that far left corner, you see that number one priority in 2019 is cloud cost optimization. It aligns right with that framework that we talked about previously. And we've seen that growth come from a rather large 58% in 2018 up to a much larger 64% in 2019. And our belief is that's going to continue to grow. As customers use cloud much more across their infrastructure, they start using cloud methodologies, that capability and that construct of optimization is going to be paramount. When you look at that next area, we start getting into those challenges. And when we think about those challenges of management, it's financial management, it's operational management, security management, availability management, those four core pillars that we've talked about so many times in this webinar. And you really see that growth of that challenge, both in advanced and intermediate workloads. So it's an interesting paradigm. And then we start looking at other top initiatives that we see out there. The initiatives that customers by and large are having, it's moving more workloads to the cloud, expanding the use of containers. We talk about microservices so often, those services that allow us to align so much better with the capabilities and constructs of the cloud, because the cloud itself is not forgiving. When we're on premise in VMware, we have things like HA and vMotion and a bunch of capabilities that allow our infrastructure to be forgiving against our applications. So we go into the cloud, those motions aren't there and those capabilities aren't there. And so microservices become such a great construct for us to deliver inside of an IaaS-based platform. And then really tying those automated policies for governance. And I would say from an automation perspective, it's not only governance, it's security, it's operational deployments and management and all those constructs and everything around that automation component. We'll talk a lot more about that as we go into those best practices. And then we start running into this construct of wasted cloud spend. So, when we think about and when we talk to customers, it's this construct of, basically a third of users underestimate that amount. And we see that across the board. It's instances being deployed that aren't being used, databases being deployed that are being underutilized, instances that are being deployed that are just over provisioned. The workload needs 1 CPU and 2 gig of memory and 5 CPU or 6 CPU, depending on the workload, and 8 or 10 gig of memory are allocated, and we start seeing those costs go out of control, and we'll talk a lot more about that as well. Josh, you want to go talk about the next slide?
Yeah, absolutely. When Jeff's talking about, a ton of those constructs, whether it be governance or whether it be looking at spin, I think really building out a central cloud team, I think is paramount. When you're thinking about, I'm moving my application into AWS, I'm moving my application into Azure or GCP, I really think, you have to have a lot of brain trust there to understand what are the things that we're trying to govern against. And I think, from a financial perspective, obviously, it's always driving costs, making sure that what we're leveraging is the right amount of cost for the business. And then from an engineering perspective is to understand what are the right platforms to bring into the application and what are the right architectures to deploy, as well as how do you optimize. When you're thinking about automating your cloud optimization, I think that you have to understand, what each platform is going to deliver for you and where are some of the gotchas, right? So when you think about what a Lightstream organization does, you think about having a professional sit there and help you go through that life cycle, help you understand how do I get from point A to point B, and then how do I continually understand what are some of my options for optimization. And optimization could be, again, from many different levers or viewpoints. It could be from cost, it could be from governance, whether governance is just operational governance, or whether it be from a regulation of PCI or a HIPAA high trust, or whether it be a just operational DevOps practice that says my change management controls abide by this, right? So when you're thinking about your CI/CD build chain, I think you're really thinking about a holistic view around how do I deliver my applications? Yes, in a quick fashion, leveraging all the great technology that all of these cloud providers provide you. Though you have to have a full scope of a team to help you understand what are some of those pitfalls as you're going through that process. It has to be a central team, I would say. It has to be somebody who understands what you're trying to deliver, not only from a technology, a business, or a value stream perspective, but it's also from a cost modeling perspective. Going into number 2, I think this is right up your wheelhouse, Jeff. What do you think?
Yeah, thanks, Josh. As you go down this path and you get to step number 2 and you really start analyzing the offerings that are available, there's a couple of components on the left-hand side that we really stress with customers, and they're areas that can really assist. One is usage patterns. So how do you use applications? How do you use those underlying workloads? How do you use all those individual components? And what do you need to do, and what cloud makes the most sense for those environments? Each one of the clouds is so very unique in the way that they're built. You have AWS and you have Azure and you have Google, and while they all have the construct of a VM, the way that they deploy, the way that they support networking, the way they support security, the way they support storage has so many variances between each. And it's really around that alignment itself, as well as your core capabilities. Some cloud providers have additional operational capabilities that can support a business. Some cloud providers have capabilities that support things like containers much better, and they have much better constructs around those ecosystems. And so really it's around, what does our usage look like? Should we be turning up and turning down resources based upon time of day or individual areas inside of the business, or work patterns or usage patterns associated with the type of business we're in? If we're in retail, we have a couple of months per year where usage patterns are very high, whereas the rest of the year, oftentimes we start getting into a steady state type of architecture. Really start going into the second bullet, which is tiered storage, and really thinking about leveraging the right storage for the right workload. Block storage is very expensive inside of the cloud, and leveraging block storage for everything is a very costly activity. And so often we look at blob types of capabilities. So whether that's an Azure Blob or S3 inside of AWS or areas like that, but then really thinking about how can we archive off that usage and leverage tags effectively to automatically migrate usage and automatically migrate storage into those more colder archive classes where we can really drop our cost model. But again, we really have to understand that workload, because there's a massive time constraint and a massive usage constraint of actually accessing that data. And there's a punitive cost structure if we access it too much. And then really that staying updated. We just went through reInvent, and reInvent had a great number of great new features that they've added into the ecosystem. Some of those are compute related, a lot of those are networking and security related, and there are just a lot of things that can help you align with your business. If you don't understand a lot of them, reach out to Armor, reach out to us and talk to us, because they're areas we can help customers really understand how to leverage these effectively, how to leverage them inside of their environment, whether it's a hybrid ecosystem, whether it's, all cloud, whether it's, multi-cloud or whatever it might be. And then on the right, we start getting into a lot of the ways of how the providers bill for resources. And there are things to think about, especially if you have microservices-based environments where you're spinning up and you're spinning down resources in a fast fashion. And then also how you can buy resources. Whether you're out there and you're just buying on a credit card, whether you're buying with a partner of one of the cloud providers, and then also how much you're committing in the form of a reservation, a reserved instance, things like that, and how you're using those services. And then one of the interesting things AWS does, especially if you're going down the microservices path, is the leveraging of Spot, and the ability to use unused resources inside of a cloud provider and getting into an auction type format, where it's really what are you willing to spend for that resource. Sometimes you win, sometimes you lose, but oftentimes you can greatly drop your cost structures inside of a cloud ecosystem, 40, 50, 80%, depending on what that workload type looks like. And if you can build automation into your ecosystem, it's a great win. Josh, did you want to add anything onto this one, or would you like to go on to the next slide?
No, I think those are great tips. I think, when you have so many offerings coming at you, I really think that you might want to lean on professionals that are keeping up to date, like a Lightstream and like an Armor, that are up to date with all the capabilities that are coming out. And it's a huge amount of features that you have to choose from. And I think getting some consultants involved to just help you if you are in the early stage journey, I think will help. As in one of our polls, I think it was a vast majority of folks don't even really understand what they spend. So I think that's a call out to really understand or see what consultants are out there to help, as a Lightstream is out there to help you guys. So yeah, I will get into the right sizing. So part of what Jeff talked about in your planning phase, and this is really around that EC2 construct itself, or an instance construct, or just a VM construct. Is I have an application, it has needs. Understanding what are a lot of those performance needs moving into the cloud, I think are important. But what we find, I think 9 times out of 10, is that you can ask a team, what are my needs of my application? And most teams will tell you, I don't necessarily know. I know that I have this geometry in an environment today, and I know that the application works, and I understand that it has 4 nines uptime. And so, when we get into that assess and planning phase, it's good to start understanding what are the true needs of your application. I've seen us take a lift and shift model of just spin up those geometries moving into a cloud provider and start watching and analyzing to understand what are the true needs, because it's a little bit easier to optimize when you're in the cloud, as long as you're taking efforts to understand what's the telemetry telling you. How much memory do you need? How much CPU do you need? And more importantly, how much hardware or storage that you need? Because as Jeff alluded to and talked about a little bit, is your block storage versus object storage. Is what are really the true I/O needs of my application? And most teams really don't understand that, and that's okay. I think as you move into the cloud, you will find that it's an evolutionary process to continually introduce new right-sizing efforts around what your application is. So when Jeff talked about a retail store, whereas we know Black Friday and we know those holiday shopping, there's probably a higher need of, let's say, compute and memory during those time periods, whereas it's a more, let's say, stable throughout the rest of the year. So when you're getting into those scaling features and those scaling capabilities, right-sizing, I would say, is an ongoing effort, because if you are a retailer, or if you do have a marketplace where you have consumers buying from you, you are going to have peak hours, you're going to have low hours, so you're always going to be tailoring your environment based on what's the sale of the month, or what is the seasonality that I'm in for my shopping needs for our consumers. You'll always be in this, I would say, right-sizing effort, ongoing, continuous, as you're moving into the cloud and as you stay into the cloud. This is a good one, and I know, Jeff, you have a lot of good tips on modern cloud architecture. Why don't you take this one?
Thanks, Josh. This is one of my favorite slides, and it gets into leveraging the right resource type and leveraging the right resources for the workloads. And both Josh and I have talked about this a lot inside of this webinar. Whether it's the technologies that we may already have, or it's the workloads that we may already have, it's how can we tie all of those components directly into an ecosystem where we're leveraging that right workload type for that individual resource. So often we talk about containers and microservices and everything that is, it's cool, it's hip, it's what's going on today inside of cloud providers and inside of IT in general and technology in general. And we really start having some great benefits inside of those ecosystems. We get cost benefits. We get the ability to leverage an instance across multiple resources and multiple workloads, and all those benefits that all of us are very aware of inside of a container. And then we start going down this construct of serverless, this construct of functions, whether it's an Azure function or it's Lambda or whatever it might be, and really start aligning those workloads effectively. If we have simple code sets to deploy, it's a great ecosystem to deploy as a function itself. And really this ability to pay for the execution of a service or an execution of a line of code versus having unused resources that might sit on a VM itself. And then also beyond just going down the microservices path is leveraging just standardized instances correctly and leveraging a modern cloud architecture on top of it. So whether that's a microservice that's running on top of Windows or Linux or any of those environments, it's leveraging that architecture effectively, leveraging load balancing and application load balancing and all of the core capabilities of that cloud provider, whether it's CDN or any of those environments to help from an availability perspective, leveraging those load balancers from an availability perspective, or the ability to mitigate risk inside of our ecosystem. Those are all very important steps. And again, both Armor and Lightstream, tremendous amount of experience in these realms, helping customers tie those workloads effectively to a workload type and helping them build that strategy going forward. Josh, anything on this slide?
No, I think that's great. I mean, I think when you start thinking about all of the modernization that has to take place, I think I've seen too often to not is that a lot of teams sit there and they're really around this just microservices and how do I adopt, and they kind of get, I would say, tied or wound up around how do I leverage these things and what's the perfect architecture for my application. I would say it's evolving. Make a choice for what you know now, implement it. We can help you, and then move forward because you're going to consistently evolve your application as you live within the cloud. So as we get into invest in unified visibility and controlled security, here at Armor we have a strong view around visibility of what you have in the cloud, just like any other good program would have. Right. So when you're running any type of application, whether you're on-prem and you're trying to understand what resources that you have, how are those load balancers working for you, firewalls working for you, your compute infrastructure, whether it be on-prem or you move into the cloud. We think that, the number one thing that we get asked from CISOs is that I just don't understand what's out in our cloud accounts. We don't know what all the teams are leveraging. The DevOps teams are deploying like crazy. They're doing agile. It's a 2-week time frames for us to build features. And so the number one complaint there is, how do I keep up my security and compliance program to protect my brand as I live in the cloud, right? Because what we see is that a lot of misconfigurations happen within the cloud, and not on purpose most of the times, is just because there's no overall visibility from a single pane of glass to tell you what's happening in the cloud, as well as, let's say, a 24/7 SOC that is there to understand any of the offenses that are coming out of, let's say, guard duty in AWS or a Sentinel of Azure, is who is there and responsible to give those security services when a detection is made, when some of the folks have deployed something that doesn't have, let's say, the right amount of access or too much access to a given resource. We feel strongly that you should use some sort of a CSPM tool to understand visibility, what's in the cloud, what's in my accounts, how does it change, and what are the policies and governance approach that do I need to put in place to understand how do we stay in, I would say, a good state or a good understandable state, meaning I'm there, I understand what we have in the cloud, and I understand when it drifts and when it doesn't. I think those are paramount for organizations as they're going to the cloud, is to have some sort of, it doesn't have to be strong governance, but it has to be a good, visible governance to everyone that's part of that cloud. Because what I think a lot of folks forget is that when you're in an on-premise solution, you're part of a whole group of folks that are governing that platform, from your developers to your IT folks to your compliance to your C folks to your security folks. Well, that doesn't change when you move into the cloud. So when you move into the cloud, all parties have to be involved, and I think having unified visibility, I would say, is the first starting point to be successful. So I think with all of those 5 tips, I think that's great. And I think that, when we'll have some of these resources online for you as you start devising a secure cloud strategy, or as you start planning some of what Jeff walked through in some of your planning phases of how do I approach from a detailed guide perspective. I think you can use some of these resources to help you as a jump off point.
Perfect. Thanks so much, Josh and Jeff, for all of those insights. And as Josh said, those resources that he mentioned about the cloud strategy white paper, as well as the cloud migration framework, those are available on the armor.com website, but they're also available in the handout section of GoToWebinar. So if you want to go ahead and just download a copy of those for yourself, feel free to. And we have a PDF copy of this presentation in the handout section for you as well. So with that, why don't we jump into the first question that we have. Let's see. It says, what is an immediate step I could take in order to adjust my current cloud strategy today?
So I think from my perspective is I would say leverage some of those resources online. If look at it, it'll sort of walk you through a step-by-step approach of what we talked about here on this webinar, just to get a good sense of where you're at now, because a lot of folks think or believe that they understand their current cloud strategy. What we find is that it may not be the same answer if you ask 5 or 10 folks within your organization. So I would say start with the guide, start walking through each question and answer so that way you get a baseline of where you're at today. I think that would be a good first step.
Jeff, what do you think about that one?
Yeah, I agree with Josh. I mean, I think, when the term cloud strategy gets thrown out, it's so different. The answer to it is so different depending on the person that you talk to. And really the key around cloud strategy is make sure, just like Josh said, make sure that cloud strategy is well understood by the entire business. And make sure that inside of that cloud strategy is a cultural component, because the cultural component drives so much of how well that cloud strategy is going to be adopted and how well it's going to be leveraged. If the culture inside of the organization, whether that's IT or maybe it's the business or whatever it might be, if the culture isn't fully bought in to leveraging the cloud and understanding what role their work or their position fits inside of the cloud, the effectiveness is often not what they were looking for. And so that's what we always tell customers is when you're looking for an immediate step, make sure you have that piece nailed. Because if you have that nailed, that will be the most beneficial thing you will ever do inside of the cloud, because everything else will fall after that. You have great employees inside of your business. You have great processes, you have great procedures, and all this have great technology. The technology out there is outstanding. It's, if you have that culture, you understand how to leverage it, and everybody's in alignment, you can either take that technology that you have and leverage it. Maybe you have to evolve a little bit, but everybody will understand why, because everybody's rowing that boat in the same direction.
Perfect. And it looks like we have one more question. What is your number one tip or trick for getting the most out of my cloud budget?
I would probably, when I think about getting the most out of your cloud, I would say that I'm going to change that a little bit into probably understanding your cloud budget and your spend, right? As we saw in the poll a little bit earlier, was that a lot of the teams or a lot of the folks that were on this call don't really understand the spend that's out there today. So I would say the number one tip I would say is to understand what you're spending. And then to start understanding, then from that point asking the question is, why are we spending that, and is it the right architecture for my application or for what I'm trying to accomplish from my feature set, right? So when you look at a feature set and you look at the cloud, there are an N number of ways that you can build that feature living in the cloud, whether it be I just build some app services or I use EC2 or I go into Lambda. And I think you have to think about all of those strategies, because some of those choices have dependencies tied to them. Whether I'm using a Lambda and now I need a gateway or I need some other object storage, I think understanding first visibly what your spend is, and then asking yourselves the question, because you'll be amazed that even as an architect, you're architecting your solution today. 6 months from that point, you might have some learnings there where you need to retool or you need to re-architect what you're doing tomorrow. And all of that has some spending consequence, right? So as you're determining what architecture you're letting the folks understand that this accomplishes the goal, I think understanding your spend and what are those consequences associated to that are really important. So gain visibility, understand why you're making architectural decisions for what features and what services I would say are important.
Awesome. Jeff, do you have any last minute comments on that question?
I do. I have a couple minutes. As you think about that, and as you think about spend, one of the first things, and we've talked about this quite a few times through this webinar, is really ensuring that you have that great foundation of your environment. And that foundation is so crucial. If you go to our website, you can read all about what we have, which is called the Cloud Foundation Framework. And it's really a quite simple paradigm. It's those 4 core tenets we've talked about numerous times. It's that operational, availability, security, as well as financial alignment. And it's ensuring that everything inside of your ecosystem is built within best practices. You know, every cloud provider out there has an architecture guidance pattern that they recommend. You know, if we focus on AWS, they have the well-architected framework, and we incorporate that in our model. And what I would tell everybody is go out, make sure first and foremost you're leveraging those best practices, because if you leverage those get you down a path to help you really understand your cloud costs. Because if your environment's built correctly and you're aligning workloads correctly with VPCs and subnets and architectures and doing all those individualized components, it makes life so much easier to understand those costs, because it's so much simpler to align those costs with underlying infrastructure. I talked before about this construct of things that are non-taggable. One of the easiest ways to deal with things that are non-taggable is to deploy accounts on a per workload basis and really aligning that into that workload construct. You know, if you want to align costs across all iterations of a workload, from dev to staging to prod to, you know, whatever other stages of that environment that you have, build them all in one account. Now you have direct bandwidth egress charges aligned directly with that workload. Some of our customers have thousands of accounts or subscriptions, depending on the cloud provider. And they do that because they can get this granular alignment. One of the other things we tell customers to do is leverage consistent workload types, instance types, VM types. You know, don't allow your teams or the business itself to deploy every single workload type that's out there. It becomes very difficult to manage. It becomes very difficult to buy reservations or reserved instances or things like that. And it allows you to buy those along much longer terms. Because if you're buying a certain instance type and you buy literally the same instance type for every workload, you can buy 3-year reservations or 3-year reserved instances. And you don't have the punitive nature of going out and selling them on the marketplace or turning them back in or any of those types of components. So just some really great things to think about from those perspectives. Last but not least, use great tools out there to really understand those costs. The cloud providers offer great tools natively. There's a lot of third-party tools out there that are outstanding, the cloud checkers of the world or organizations like that. And then we also offer a great tool as well for customers that leverage our services that we provide. But really the key is leverage great tools on top of it that can really help you align those costs directly with the needs of the business. And you'll be in such a great position from a cost alignment perspective, cost containment, and ultimately cost optimization.
Wonderful. Wonderful. Thank you. Perfect. So this actually concludes our webinar for today. I do ask all the attendees, we will have a post-webinar survey that we'll send out, so feel free to give your feedback there, as well as if you come up with any questions that you want us to send to Josh and Jeff, we are happy to do that. You are more than welcome to leave those in that webinar survey as well. And I just want to thank Josh and Jeff for joining us today and, taking time out of your day to talk through how we can optimize our cloud spend and really get, a really good cloud strategy in place, especially as we go into the new year. So thank you guys for presenting, and then thank you everybody for attending today, and we hope you have a wonderful rest of your day.
My pleasure. Thank you.